I want to discuss now with Charles Coleman Jr. He's a civil rights attorney.
Joining me now to discuss all of this, civil rights attorney and former New York prosecutor Charles Coleman.
Civil rights attorney Charles Coleman Jr. He's also a former prosecutor and trial attorney.
Welcome back to Arise Review, and of course we're back with civil rights attorney Charles Coleman here in New York at Arise.
I'm Flynn Sweet and civil rights attorney Charles Coleman, who's with me here in New York. Ryan, to you
so
first.
much to talk about here. I want to bring in civil rights attorney and former New York prosecutor Charles Coleman Jr.
All right, Debbie, thanks. We're here again with Charles Coleman, civil rights attorney, but also...
All right, Charles Coleman is a civil rights attorney and a former prosecutor and trial lawyer. He joins me now.
And civil rights lawyer Charles Coleman here in the studio.
Talking about Charles Coleman is a civil rights attorney and a former prosecutor and trial lawyer.
Civil rights attorney Charles Coleman. That's the case. Charles Coleman Jr. He is a former prosecutor in Brooklyn, New York, and now is a civil rights attorney. Charles, great to have you back.
Part of the problem with that logic is that police have for years used that as a justification to increase policing. The flaw is that it's self-fulfilling. So if you say that you're going to police areas where there are higher amounts of crime because that's what's necessary because black people commit more crime, and then that's where you are and that's where you concentrate your resources, well, that's what you're going to find. It's somewhat of the old adage that if you're looking for something, then you're going to find it.
Who decides whether they want just a judge?
That's going to be a decision that the defendants will make. They can waive their right to a jury trial. As you all know, you will have a constitutional right to a trial by a jury of your peers, but you can waive that right if you are a defendant. And what that does is it puts the case squarely in front of the judge as a bench trial, but then it becomes a question of law, not a question of fact. Jurors are fact determiners. They determine what the facts may have been depending on what they hear from each side. But when you put it in front of a judge, you're basically conceding what the facts are and asking for the judge to make a ruling specifically on the law. And in a case like this, where public opinion and public pressure weighs so heavily, when you do make it about black and white letter law and you put it in front of the judge, it gives those defendants more of a fighting chance. So this was a strategic move by Nero's attorneys, and it would not at all surprise me to see any one of the remaining 4 defendants in this case opt for a jury trial as well. I mean, a bench trial as well.
But that's
I think it's important to remember, because oftentimes what we have happen is we have human beings that are turned into hashtags overnight. And this really brought it home, as you said, because what so many people don't realize is that these are fathers, these are brothers, these are sons. Alton Sterling was the father of 5 people.
There was a baby in the car.
There was a baby in the car in Minnesota. Eric Garner was a father. You know, we oftentimes don't realize the extent of broken lives that are affected by violence against innocent citizens, because I want to be clear about something. People may say, well, there was weed in the car, or Alton Sterling had probation, and he shouldn't have had a gun. But at the time that these encounters happen with law enforcement, these are innocent people. Now, while it may seem just egregious to the common eye, the way that California law is written requires that absent a death, which we don't have in this case, that prosecutor would need to be able to establish that that trigger was pulled willfully and intentionally and with a conscious effort by Officer Feaster. He can't make that out, which is why he's chosen not to prosecute in this case. And I also think it raises some interesting question as to mindset. So on one hand, you're talking about shock and confusion being the mindset of the officer and what is taking place, but then on the other hand, you're saying that you're not able to prove intent. So both of those sort of reflect the mindset, and it's kind of curious to me that he's able to comment about one mindset with respect to shock and confusion, but then with respect to the willful discharge of this weapon, he's saying, well, we can't prove that beyond a reasonable doubt, we have nothing and we're not able to prosecute. So those things kind of sort of don't jive and reconcile with each other very well, which sort of struck as being very odd to me when I listened to the prosecutor and read his report. You know, we're looking at some very alarming and very concerning statements coming from a sitting Supreme Court justice. And quite frankly, these remarks were racist and they were highly offensive. At the point that a prosecutor makes a decision to go and present a case in front of a grand jury, their mission is to secure an indictment. And I felt like they sort of just put everything in front of the grand jury and decided, well, we'll see what sticks, as opposed to having a very strategic, very tactical approach to try and secure an indictment against Darren Wilson. If there's anything that I could take away positively from the sheriff's remarks today in his press conference, is that they were called in, and at the point that the school resource officer gets involved, he's treating it as a criminal situation. He's not worried about classroom discipline. He's not looking at it as a school situation. His mindset is taking down a criminal. Now, I completely disagree with that mindset in terms of how that was executed. Oh, it sends a horrible message to the kids in that classroom. I mean, think about it. You're talking about school safety officers who are in that classroom to ensure the protection of those students. And if you watch that video, what you see on the faces of those children is terror. You see fear. fear. And that's woefully ironic that the person who's charged with protecting them is the person that they fear the most. They have to be able to articulate that there was an imminent threat of danger to them or to someone else that they were responding to. And based off of what we've seen thus far, they can't do that, which is what makes this so problematic. There's a big problem in Chicago. They've got a serious problem with respect to this investigation and how it was conducted. If 60% of what was just said was true with respect to IPRA not ever contacting him, he being the only one who took the deposition of the officer who fired the shots, and now this question as to whether there was actually a gun, there's going to be some serious digging on behalf of the Department of Justice into this situation, and it's only going to immerse the Chicago Police Department further in hot water. We are making each and every one of these situations about the facts. Did this person do this? Did this person not? Et cetera, et cetera. Those are decisions that should be made by a jury. Those are decisions that should be made in a criminal court of law, because that's what our system dictates. Yeah. These are not decisions to be made after the fact as an officer has decided to take matters into his own hands and kill someone. One of the things that has struck me as a former prosecutor was particularly with respect to Darren Wilson's testimony in the grand jury. I never got the sense that the prosecutor was actually looking to secure an indictment. It felt, when I read the transcript, more like a direct examination where there were very open-ended questions and Darren Wilson was essentially allowed to just tell his story. Now, when I was a prosecutor in the DA's office here in New York, one of the things that I relished was getting a witness who testified in the grand jury, because that was my opportunity to really nail it to them with a cross-examination. I never got that sense. I didn't get the sense that the prosecutor really wanted to push for the indictment, particularly when they had Wilson on the stand in the grand jury.
And there were so many things. So if the bar is so high, as you so eloquently put it, I mean, should the family take any comfort whatsoever in the fact that the Justice Department is investigating this?
As much as I would like to say that there should be comfort, the reality is that we've seen this movie before and we know how it ends. It always ends up being a case where the department may find that there is some sort of systemic wrongdoing or a pattern of aggressive behavior against communities of color, but at the same time that they do that, they don't find enough to actually charge the individual officers who are responsible for the deaths of these people. So, for example, in Ferguson, Missouri, 2 summers ago, we saw when Michael Brown was killed, the Department of Justice came in, they did an entire investigation, and they found throughout the course of this investigation that Ferguson police actually did have a culture of systemic racism. And at the same time that they found that, and that they had fees, and that they had injunctive relief for the people of Ferguson, they simultaneously said that they did not have enough to bring federal civil rights charges against Darren Wilson, the actual actor who killed Michael Brown. And so, when you talk about whether the family should find any comfort in this, it really becomes a question of whether they're okay with being told that no one is responsible for their son's death, in light of the fact that the department may come back and say, well, you know, there's a systemic problem here and that needs to be remedied. I'm not a parent, but if I was, I would have a problem accepting that. But, you know, having done trials, it happens.
Former prosecutor.
Right, as a former prosecutor, I can say that regardless of how straightforward the law may be or how clear it is or how clear the facts may seem, the court of public opinion absolutely plays a role in how these things play out. When you talk about overreaction, it seems like we're only having these sorts of conversations about overreactions when it comes to a certain group of people. Dylan Roof can walk into a church, kill 9 people. He's armed to the teeth. And he gets escorted to Burger King after he's apprehended without a scratch. He goes to trial because that's what our system says will happen. Individuals can bomb a marathon in Boston, be hunted down by police, ultimately apprehended. One of them goes to trial because that's what our system says happens. Aurora, Colorado, man shoots up a movie theater. He's apprehended. Sets explosives throughout his entire home. He's apprehended, goes to trial because that's what our system says happens. There's no overreaction there. There's no overreaction when it comes to those individuals. And the only difference that I can discern, hold on, just let me finish. The only difference that I can discern in those instances is that those officers had to be well aware that there would be consequences for overreactions. And there are no consequences. There's no accountability when you talk about the loss and violation of Black lives. Of course there are.
Tell our viewers what your parents told you about how to react with the police, or what you may tell your children.
I'll be as candid with you as possible, Richard.
Be as candid as you like.
I'm 36 years old. I'm an attorney. I've never been to jail. I don't have any children. I've never been arrested whatsoever. Right now, with tensions being as high as they are, I walk around with as much concern, as much apprehension, and as much feeling of being unsafe as if I was a convicted felon walking around with drugs and guns on me. And that's important to understand because
But is there a difference to the way you're treated when you're in court and when you're in a suit than if you were walking around in a tracksuit and hoodie?
You would think that there is, but there isn't. Because I'm not always in a suit. No, none of us are. See, and that's the thing that people need to understand. Right. We experience the police very differently because I'm not always dressed like this, nor should I have to be, in order to, be treated like a human being with dignity and with respect and not be in fear for my life. And that's a critical